Okay, welcome to week 4. We're going to continue talking about the Texas Constitution. In the previous week, if you watched the video, we talked about what a constitution is, defined constitutions, and talked about Texas, the Texas Constitution specifically, and how it's alike and different from the U.S. Constitution. We talked about the length and the number of amendments that the Texas Constitution had. And then we started down the path of talking about the different constitutions that has governed the area known as Texas. We started with the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas in 1827, then moved to the Constitution of the Republic of Texas, and that's where we're going to pick up our story. And again, the Constitution of the Republic of Texas was in 1836. Okay. One of the unique things about the 1836 Constitution was that it did call for Texas to join the United States. Nevertheless, it remained an independent republic for 9 years. And the primary roadblock to annexation was concern that Texas would enter the Union as a slave state, number one, which would disrupt an already delicate balance between free and slave states in the United States. But in addition, the United States feared that the possibility of annexation would spark a war with Mexico. In 1845, however, Congress passed a resolution allowing for the annexation of the state of Texas. This picture here just happens to be a picture of the Alamo that still you can visit today. Okay, so if we think about the Constitution with 1845, this is a depiction of taking down the Texas flag and then raising the U.S. flag as a new member of the Union. So a new state constitution had to be drafted. The Constitution continued to specify separation of powers and a system of checks and balances. Okay. The term for legislatures were lengthened to 2 years for the Texas House and 4 years for the Texas Senate. But one of the things that was most important to think about with this new Constitution is that it handed over all defense-related property to America. Remember, as a republic, as an independent country, Texas was responsible for its own defense. And in joining the Constitution, it had to hand over in joining the Union, Texas had to hand over all defense-related property. So all the munitions, all that material that was necessary for a military. But it was able to keep its public lands, which was very vast, as you can see on a map, and it also kept its debt. Okay, and so we have these 3 branches of government again with checks and balances. We have a governor with a limited term. It was shortened to 2 years, and he was prohibited from serving more than 4 years in any 6. Judges were appointed for 6-year terms. This is something that will change over time. And then there was a provision that allowed the state to divide itself into as many as 5 new states. Of course, this has never occurred. Some additional information about this new Constitution. One of the things that concerned many Texans was the fact that they were in debt and highly distrustful of creditors. So the Constitution established guarantees against imprisonment for debt. The provisions protecting slavery remained in this new Constitution. In addition, the Constitution mandated that 1/10 of the state's annual revenue be set aside to create a permanent school fund. So education became an important element of Texas state politics. Okay. But overall, this new Constitution was very brief and very flexible. All right. When war broke out in the United States, the Civil War in 1861, each of the different states quickly decided on which side they were going to stand. And so Texas, being a southern state and being in favor of slavery, joined the Confederate States, and so it had to create a new constitution when it joined the Confederacy. So slavery drove Texas from the Union in 1861, and it had become a vital institution to the Texas economy. If you remember, we talked a few weeks ago about how prevalent farming and plantation of cotton was, particularly in East Texas, and slaves made up 30% of the state's population in order to support this cotton industry in the state of Texas. So pressure to secede mounted after Lincoln was elected president. but the question of secession divided Texas along regional, ethnic, and partisan lines. The governor at the time, Sam Houston, which this university is named after, did not support secession, but he was bypassed by a convention of lawyers and slaveholders. So Texas voters approved secession in February of 1861 and voted to leave the United States and join the Confederacy. So a new constitution was drafted to guide the state as it entered the Confederacy. And the 1861 Constitution remained essentially the same as the one in 1845, which let Texas be part of the Union originally, except that the reference to the United States of America were replaced with references to the Confederate States of America. It protected slavery, eliminated past slave emancipation clauses, and declared the freeing of slaves illegal. So the difference between this and its previous constitution was slavery received even stronger protection. Okay. All right. Well, after the Civil War is over, the former states that were the Confederate states rejoined the Union. Okay, so readmission to the United States required a new Constitution of 1866. Former slaves were freed. They were allowed to own their own property and to sue, but they weren't allowed to vote or hold office. Another provision of this new Constitution was that salaries for office holders were increased, which did not please many voters. And this new Constitution was ratified by a very slim majority. There was a provisional governor, Andrew Jackson Hamilton. The structure of the government outlined in the new Constitution was very similar to what had been established in the 1845 and the 1861 Constitution. Changes complied with President Johnson's policy of Reconstruction, including a rejection of the right to secede, a repudiation of war debt incurred by the state, and the abolition of slavery. The Constitution granted freedmen rights to their person and property, but again, they were denied suffrage and the right to hold political office. Okay. This Constitution did not last very long, and one of the major reasons is because of the era of Reconstruction. So the former Union General Edmund Davis governed Texas under the Constitution of 1869, what's known as the Reconstruction Constitution. And this is the Constitution that granted then Davis, the general, vast powers, and he was perceived as presiding over a very corrupt administration. So the 1869 Constitution came about because of the need to meet the requirements of the Congressional Reconstruction Acts of 1867 that was passed by the federal government. Democrats were opposed to the convention, but radical Republicans, these are the radical Republicans in the U.S. Congress, pushed through the adoption of black suffrage as well as an extended period of military occupation of the South following the Civil War. So this is when Reconstruction begins. Certain features of this new 1869 Constitution stand out. First, the United States Constitution was declared the supreme law of the land. Slavery was forbidden, and blacks were given the right to vote. The 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution guarantees equality before the law, and this was recognized by the states as well. The three branches of government were altered. The number of legislatures were changed. The executive branch was given more power, especially with respect to appointments. The size of the Texas Supreme Court was reduced. And finally, state official salaries were increased. This new Constitution went into effect after it was published under order by military officials. And so this gentleman here, Edmund Davis, he's a Republican and a former Union general, served as governor under the new Constitution. Okay. So again, here are some of the reasons why this new Constitution was required by the Reconstructionist leaders of the United States. So Congress forced these different states in the South to alter their constitutions as part of the cost of rejoining the Union. So it was never approved by a Texas Constitutional Convention. It was approved instead by military orders. And again, these are some of the elements of this new Constitution that I just described. Okay, so this Constitution was viewed as an anomaly in the Texas state history. The provisions were more radical than the average Texan preferred. So this Constitution was boycotted by many Democrats in the state. And so all of this is happening under a military occupation of the state of Texas. Once the Reconstruction period ended and all former Confederates were able to vote, Democrats won back control of the state legislature and the governorship, and they went back to writing a new Constitution. Okay, so this is the Constitution of 1876. It comes about after a convention in 1875 that was called to rectify the shortcomings of the 1869 Constitution, and each delegate to this convention of 1875 was selected by a popular vote. 40 delegates were members of what are called the Grange. The Grange was a militant farmers' movement in the late 19th century that fought for improved conditions for farmers. 75 were Democrats, 15 were Republicans, and there were 6 blacks at this constitutional convention. And the framers agreed on a constitution with 4 major themes. The first is there was strong support for a stronger popular control of government. This meant that the governor's appointment powers were limited, and public officials such as judges would be subject to an election by a white male electorate. So again, we're only talking about white males voting, but what they wanted was a limited powers granted to the government, specifically the governor's appointment powers, and judges were going to be elected to office. Within this idea of powers that are going to be limited, executive powers would be different among several different executive office holders. The legislature would only be part-time and meet every other year or biennially. Legislators' salaries were lowered. Again, the judicial branch was elected rather than appointed. And finally, government actions were limited by the Constitution. A third theme was the idea of restraint on spending. The Constitution restricted the extent to which state governments could tax and incur debt. Limits were placed on office holders' salaries. Compulsory education was eliminated, and education was decentralized. And then we have the promotion of farming or agrarian interests, and this reflects the presence of farmers in the Grange movement at the convention. So this new Constitution included provisions that protected homesteads and regulated banks and railroads. Finally, it's important to note that this new Constitution was a painstakingly detailed and rigid document. Remember, all the previous constitutions were very flexible and brief. This was very detailed, very rigid, and very long, and placed many restrictions on government. Okay, so this was very different than the U.S. Constitution that we have today. Okay. So again, these are some of the information that I just provided for you. It's a reaction to the powers held by the governor under the last Constitution. So we can see a stark departure from the previous constitutions, where this Constitution was very detailed and very inflexible. And remember, last week I showed you the graphs where Texas has the second longest Constitution and the fourth. It's a state that has it's the fourth. It's a state that has the fourth highest number of amendments. All right, so if we think about the Texas Constitution today, again, it's long and detailed. It's 8 times as long as the U.S. Constitution, and again, that's how many amendments it has. And so this system that the Constitution reflects today is accumulation of power by the state vis-a-vis localities, and works to keep government accountable to people. Okay. Unlike the U.S. Constitution that was designed to create a strong central government that would nevertheless be restrained and non-tyrannical, the Texas Constitution was designed to limit government authority without the complementary concern for effective governance. So on the one hand, the U.S. Constitution, it's brief, allows for a great deal of flexibility. The Texas State Constitution is extremely long, and it makes it very difficult for power to be concentrated. And so the goal of the Texas Constitution is first and foremost limiting government so that government power cannot be used against the people. Okay? And so we have now today a very long and convoluted Texas Constitution. The rights are listed right up front in order to stress the limits upon the state's powers. It contains an element where the right of the people, one of the rights of the people is the ability to dismiss the government. It has a Bill of Rights, which is very similar to the U.S. Constitution, but it's also much more detailed and specific. It doesn't merely mention rights, it specifically defines them in the Texas Constitution. All right, what if we were to want to change the Constitution, which has happened a great many times in the Texas case, again 467 times. There's 4 stages to amending the Constitution. The legislature has to propose these amendments. These amendments have to be approved by 66% of all members of each chamber, both the House and the Senate. The proposed amendments must be published twice in a recognized newspapers, and then it goes to the public where a majority of state voters must approve. So that is the legislative process to amend the Constitution. Okay. All right, well, that's where we're going to end talking about the Constitution. We'll continue next week on the new topic. So make sure you do the readings and stay tuned to week 5's lectures.